Kamma Daf Nun Bet Amud Bet, limits of responsibility, Amrinin Migu Dahavi Pושע. During the Second World War, there was a village in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and the Germans came and they took everybody from the village and put them into the shul. We know this happened in other places too. Locked the shul, poured petrol all over the shul, and were about to set the shul on light. There was a young yeshiva man there and his friend who started davening like crazy. The other people from the village were upset with him. So this is no time to daven, it's too late to daven. Prepare for your death, this is no time for tefillah. But they didn't take any notice, they continued davening and davening. All of a sudden there's a big noise at the door bursts open and a Wehrmacht officer, a senior Wehrmacht officer comes in and says, "What are you doing here?" He says to his people. And he says, "We're about to exterminate these Jews." He says, how can you do that? That's not what you do as a human being, that's not how we work. We have a system, we have a method. You don't burn people alive. That's not the German way. And he said, "Let them go immediately." And that person, that young boy, turned to his friend and quoted the Chazal of Afilu cherev chada munachat al tzavaro, even if a sharp sword is on your neck about to execute you, al yityaesh min ha'geula. At no time are you entitled to give up hope. That even at the last minute, there's no point at which you can give up hope. Everybody was yelling at them to prepare for their death. It was done. It was a done thing. Everybody knew what the Germans were. That there was going to be a nace that a German officer himself would step in to intervene. What chance is there of that? There's nothing at all. But al yityaesh min ha'geula, don't give up hope. And even though we learnt in our last year that the angels step aside and stop protecting us once there's a gezerah, but tefillah can still help. That's the angels. The angels step aside, but Hashem is still in charge, of course. So the angel can't intervene if Hashem has made a decision. As we said in the last year, an angel can't intervene if Beis Din has made a decision. An angel can't even intervene or won't even intervene if you've made a decision that it's over. But even if there's been a gezerah that it's over, tefillah can still turn the gezerah around. Prayer can still turn the decree around and can bring a change in circumstance even in the last moment. At no point are we allowed to give up hope, even in the last moment. That's what he said to his friend. That person survived the war and came to the United States. He became a butcher. His son was a shochet. He was a shochet in sons in Europe, and he came to New York. And he gave up shchita because the New York butchers used to impose such a quota on them that he felt he couldn't shecht with Yerushalayim. So instead he took a job in a butchery. That person's son, the grandson of the person who survived this terrible incident, is a very important follower of the Matmonim. It's a big Talmud Chochem in New York, a wonderful person. Feel very humbled and honored that he describes the Matmonim as a work of art and exercise in perfection. And today is the yortzeit of his grandfather who survived that event, and today he's asked us to dedicate the shir to the Ilu in Nishmas Reb Chaim ben Rabbi Yosef Herbst, dedicated by his grandson Rabbi Yisrael Meir Herbst, to whom we're grateful. This is the second time he's dedicated a shir. Today we're going to explore the boundaries of carelessness in a particular area and also experience some of the fineness of Torah thinking as we get to it. Now, we've already established that a bor, this mazik, this damage caused by the pit, this icon that we use as the pit for a particular category of damage, is unique and very different. And in the Torah, it says the real issue there is not that he dug the bor, but velo yechasenu. The fact that he didn't cover the bor is the real issue that we talk about. Our Gemara asks the following question: Kisahu kisu sheyachol la'amod bifnei shvarim ve'en yachol la'amod bifnei gemalim. He covered the pit, but it wasn't 100% covering. It was good enough for oxen, who are the animals that usually walk past the area. But if a camel were to walk past, this was not a strong enough covering to support the camel. Shchichi gemalim, and there are camels there. He should have thought of the possibility of camels coming. But in the end, camels didn't come. What happened? Hitliya mitocho, it started decaying. The wood, the covering started decaying after a period of time, and it collapsed. And then an ox or whoever was damaged. Mi amrinן migu dahavi pושע etzel gemalim havu pושע nami le'inyan hatla o dilma lo amrinן migu. The Gemara says, do we hold him responsible because it all started out with some degree of carelessness? It's true he can't be held responsible for not predicting the erosion of the piece of wood, but it wasn't a good enough cover. There are camels around there, and the cover wasn't good enough for camels. Yeah, but camels weren't the problem. It was good enough for oxen, and what came there eventually was an ox. It's just that the covering was damaged by its own erosion, and therefore it wasn't his carelessness that caused it. But still, the covering wasn't a good enough covering. Do we say the covering wasn't a good enough covering? When it says v'chisahu v'lo yichasenu, it means he must cover it with a covering that is 100% secure. Then if there's an honest, okay, I understand. But here it wasn't 100% secure. It was only 50% secure. It was good for oxen, but not good for camels. The Gemara brings a proof and comes to the conclusion, Lo amrinן migu, we don't say this migu, you're only responsible for what you predicted. You made a covering that was good enough for oxen, that's a good enough covering. The fact that afterwards it became eroded and it got damaged, that you couldn't have predicted, and that's called an onus. We're going to deal with the Baal HaMaor, a question that the Baal HaMaor asks, which many of the Rishonim ask. All the Baalei Tosfos ask for, Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz and Tosfos Rid and our Tosfos and the Rashbo asks it as well. And we're going to deal with a very strange answer of the Baal HaMaor. The Baal HaMaor says there are two different issues in this topic. The one is the migu that we're talking about. That is, we say, yes, what happened in the end was an honest, that's true. But you didn't do your job fully either. So you're responsible. The cover you put over the pit was not 100% cover. And therefore it's not called yichasenu. That's not called a covering. So you've left the pit uncovered. And you're responsible for that. That's which is what the Gemara is asking here. But ask the Baal HaMaor, we have another situation. And he brings a Gemara from Bava Metzia, which we'll get to, not in not too long a time, where the Gemara talks there about a man who he's got something to look after. He's a shomer. He is a guardian of property, of an asset that belongs to somebody else. And he puts it in a hut, which is secure against thieves. And it's stolen. And the Gemara says there, even though it was, they broke in, but they were just very smart thieves. It was a good protection against thieves, but it wasn't a good protection against fire. Had a fire come, he would have been a pושע, he would have been considered careless. How could you have put it in this wooden hut and you know that there are fires in the region? But a fire didn't come. A thief came. And it was well locked to protect from thieves. That case is called tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones. It starts off with an act of carelessness and it ends off with something that couldn't have been anticipated. These are the two different ideas which sound very similar. And the Baal HaMaor is exploring the difference. Remember the Baal HaMaor, so there's 13th century, he comes from Provence, and he writes this as almost a Tosfos on the Rif. The Rif, like, summarizes the Gemara, is very short. It was the Rif's methodology, and the Baal HaMaor was worried that the Rif's methodology would penetrate Europe. As great as the Rif was, his work was so powerful, he was worried that the European method would be lost. The European method was the Baalei Tosfos that we have in northern France and in Germany, and the Chachomim of Provence as well, where they were very analytical. Everything was analyzed and compared, and things weren't just decided. Always the reason was given with it. Whereas in the North African tradition, certainly the Rif and the Rambam was no reasons, just this is the halacha, this is how it is, this is the bottom line. And they were worried about bottom line kind of halacha penetrating Europe. So the Baal HaMaor, like the Raiva did with the Rambam, the Baal HaMaor did with the Rif. As high as he held the Rif in his esteem, he still wrote this work to question the Rif, to analyze the Rif. And the Rif comes to the conclusion like the Gemara does here. And this is where the Baal HaMaor asks the question, says, okay, I understand that migu doesn't work. We say the fact that he covered it well enough for an ox, that's not called a pshia anymore. That's called a proper kisui. He covered it. But what about tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones? There is an element of pshia, there's an element of carelessness. He didn't make it strong enough for camels. So he was careless about protecting it against camels. As it emerges, it wasn't that, it eroded. The erosion was an honest. Why don't we consider this? Tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones. Starts off with carelessness and ends with honest. And we establish in Bava Metzia that everybody agrees you're chayav, that you're obligated. That's called carelessness. If your carelessness results in something unforeseeable, but had you not been careless, the unforeseeable wouldn't have happened, you are responsible because you started off with a carelessness, even though the actual event was unforeseeable. That's tchilato b'pshia v'sofo b'ones. Why don't we apply that here, says the Baal HaMaor? Baal HaMaor gives a very strange answer. It says because bor is different. What is different about bor? Bor, in the case of the pit, you are not responsible to pay for broken vessels, only for the animal. So if an ox is carrying cargo, you have to pay for the ox, but not for the cargo. That's shor v'lo adam and chamor v'lo kelim. Shor v'lo kelim, chamor v'lo adam. That's Gzeres HaKos of the Torah says. So you see, bor is different. That's all he says. That's all the Baal HaMaor says. So what? How does that explain why we don't say this is a case which ended with an ones, with something that was unpredictable, but it started with carelessness? And since you started with carelessness, let's say that was not a proper cover. You didn't do your job covering the pit. And therefore, whatever happened afterwards, you should be responsible for. So the Rivo in our Tosfos answers it, and the Ravav based in the Baal HaEshkol, who was a Rebbe of the Baal HaMaor, answers it. The Baal HaMaor brings his answer and pushes it aside and goes through it, and eventually says, the only way to answer it is this idea that bor is unique. And you know that bor is unique because you're not chayav for kelim, you don't have to pay for the cargo, you only have to pay for the ox. That's a very unique din of bor. And there would be no way to understand this Baal HaMaor except for the most wonderful sefer, which is called Ner Lamaor. Ner Lamaor is by Rabbi of Ohr Ra'anan. Rabbi of Ohr Ra'anan was a talmid of my father when he was a student at Witz in Johannesburg. And then he went from there, he went to learn. He married my cousin, Rabbi Elia's granddaughter. He came to learn in Mir. She passed away. He then married another talmidah of my father. So my father has a great investment in this man, Rabbi of Ohr Ra'anan, who lives today in Telstone, is an Adam Gadol Mod b'Torah, is a giant in Torah. Quiet, he lives in Telstone, people don't even know him. And he wrote a book, the Ner Lamaor, on the Baal HaMaor, through Shas, explaining the Baal HaMaor. And the way he explains the Baal HaMaor is in the following way. He says, what the Baal HaMaor is saying is not just there's a technical difference between bor and between the other cases of mazikin. We know we've got all these mazikin. We've got shor with all the different subcategories of shor, and we've got eish, and we've got adam mazik, and we've got bor. Bor is different from all the others, not just because of the technicality that you don't pay for the cargo. The technicality reveals an essential difference, and the difference is, in the others, what you're responsible for is having in your possession a mazik that is unprotected. A cause of damage, you've got something harmful that is not well protected. You've got a gun and it's not in a safe. You've got something harmful and it's not protected. You are responsible because you've got something harmful unprotected. And you're going to be responsible no matter what happens. If you were careless in the protection, you are responsible for whatever happens, even if it's anonymous. Because that's the problem. The reason for the chiyuv is that you have an unprotected mazik. But in the case of bor, that's not the issue. It's velo yechasena, as we started developing the idea a few days ago. It's velo yechasena. The thing with bor is, it's not that you're in possession of a pit that is unprotected. You're not in possession of it. It's in Reshut HaRabim. Your problem is you didn't cover it. So your problem is the pshia. You are careless in that you didn't cover it. Carelessness for not covering it is, if the problem is you in your possession is a harmful object, then you are obligated for whatever harm it causes. But if you're responsible for the carelessness, then you start splitting the carelessness up. I was careless as far as camels were concerned. I wasn't careless as far as oxen were concerned. So is this called yechasenu? Did I cover the pit? Is this a covering? So what he's saying here is, at the end of the day, if you cover a pit, no matter what you cover it with, it's not protected against a bunker buster bomb that you might drop on it. There's a limit to a man-made protection over a pit. It's never going to be 100%. So you've always got to look at it in terms of how well has it protected against what damage. You've got a home. Is your home protected against, people ask what happened in Gaza on October the 7th, and one of the things that the Israeli army is saying is the wall around Gaza was built for a few terrorists. It wasn't built for an army of terrorists. So we can say, does that mean we were careless by not building it against an army of terrorists? No, it's a wall. It's a valid wall. It's a yechasenu. If you've covered a pit with a covering that works for oxen, that's called a kisa. You're no longer careless. The fact that afterwards something else happens, that's not, that doesn't apply here, because the issue is not your possession of the mazik. The issue is your carelessness with respect to specific things. Just as you see a bor, you're not obligated for cargo, only for the ox itself. So you learn from there that the element of obligation is the carelessness, not the possession. And if it's carelessness, you've got to say careless for what? And one has to, for this is a good example. We were careless in that we didn't protect our state from a massive threat coming out of Gaza. We didn't know that there could be, that was careless. But to say the wall was worthless, no, the wall was built for what it was built for. It was valid for what it was built for. It kept individual terrorists out for years and years. That doesn't mean that was careless. So when we use the term of carelessness, whether within ourselves, whether we hold ourselves accountable or we're holding other people accountable, it's always important to distinguish what kind of carelessness are we talking about. Are we talking about a carelessness of an umbrella nature? Now that you are careless, whatever results from your carelessness, you are responsible for. As in the case of a shor or eish, the other mazikim. If you're careless in the way you take care of a fire, whatever the fire does, you are responsible for. Or is it like a case of bor, where it's not that you have something that you shouldn't have in the first place. There is something damaging that you've created, and you're obligated to cover it, to make sure that that it is protected. And if you were careless in the protection, then you've got to look specifically at what that carelessness was. We haven't taken this idea to its full conclusion. We might have an opportunity to do so tomorrow on Daf Nun Gimel, but just to open this idea based on the Baal Amor of how intrinsically different bor is from the others. It's not the important thing from the Baal Amor, as Rabbi Ornstein explains, is this is not a technical difference. This is a foundational principle. When we're looking at bor compared to the other mazikim, there's a foundational difference in whether the issue is whether the chiyuv is that I possessed something that was unprotected, or is the chiyuv that I was negligent in something, in an obligation that the Torah gave me, which I didn't fulfill correctly.